I understand the maintenance requirements for Prince of Wales aircraft were immensely high.
Well, they were Queen's flight standard.
But compared with the average student, did you find that galled a little? That there was one chap here was being taught to fly in an aircraft, whereas the average student wouldn't have anywhere near that level of maintenance done to his machine?
No, not really. I mean, I think, remember, this is quite a long time ago, and attitudes were very different. And, the fact was that he was going to fly in these aeroplanes, and they had to be engineered to Queen's flight standards. And I think I set it out in the book what that meant. But I mean, for example, all major components like hydraulic pumps, generators, things like that had to be half-lifed. Right. And routine servicing had to be done on a more frequent basis, things like that. And I think everyone and those aeroplanes were also guarded 24 hours a day. And I think everyone just accepted, that he was the heir to the throne, and appropriate measures had to be taken.
Absolutely. Yeah, I understand that.
But on the other hand, he did the flying course.
Now, so there was no free passes. He earned his wings very much as any other student would have done.
He did all the tests, to get his instrument rating, his navigation test, and then of course he was assessed in formation flying, all the other bits and pieces, and of course finally the final handling test, which said, okay, you're good enough to get your wings.
That's brilliant. And he would have been good enough to move on eventually to a squadron had he been allowed to?
Yes, he didn't know it at the time, but we did a posting board on the whole of one graduate entry. And if he had stayed in the Air Force and subject to satisfactory completion of advanced flying training, he was earmarked for Phantoms, for F1, the air defence Phantom, yeah.
Oh, well, that would have been great. He might have been one of my squadron chums.
Could well have been, but I mean, just to round this off, I mean, we talked about it. Well, I say we talked about it. He talked to me about it because he actually was, he wanted to explore the possibilities of staying in the Royal Air Force because he enjoyed his flying so much. I had to say to him, I said, it's a practical impossibility. He said, why? And I said, well, if you go to a Phantom, if you were to go, for example, to a Phantom squadron, I didn't tell him that, this is what he'd been earmarked for. I mean, basically the squadron would be grounded because to meet the conditions that are placed on the engineering of your aeroplanes on a Phantom squadron, which is many, many times more complicated, obviously, than a Jet Provost Mark V, you would have, the whole squadron would have been grounded. I mean, putting aside the risk element of it. And then I said, the other thing, of course, is that you're going to go to Dartmouth in September to join the Royal Navy. Yes. And I don't see anyone sort of going to upset that arrangement. So I can remember we talked about it nearly for a whole morning. But then, of course, he got his flying in the Royal Navy on helicopters with the Fleet Air Arm.
He sounds like you got on with him very well. In fact, he played that practical joke on you when you pitched up at Lucas, I believe.
It wasn't a practical joke. It was just right off the cuff. Yeah, it left me there. Go on.
Well, you must tell the story, please, because it's very funny.
Well, but basically, we flew up to Lucas to visit 43 Squadron. The object being, by then he had finished all his training, and he knew he was going to get his wings, and the Air Force said, right, before you leave the Royal Air Force, we'd like you to fly in some of our frontline aeroplanes. And so he was going to fly in a Phantom. And so one afternoon in July, we flew up to Lucas. My ground crew, the only people allowed to touch these aeroplanes, had pre-positioned up there. We arrived, and he was met by the station commander. By then we had sort of had this little system of getting out of an aeroplane if he was going somewhere in the Jet Provost, that I would taxi it in, and he would have his pin into his seat and so on, and ready to get straight out, leap out and so on, leaving me to do the shutdown checks and all the other bits and pieces. So the station commander met him, and there was saluting, and off they all went up to 43 Squadron's crew room, and I was left there on my own. I had a chat with my ground crew, and then I sort of ambled across to the squadron, went up into the crew room. And there he was. He was sitting down there at a round table, surrounded by the station commander, the boss, Hank Martin, who I remember, QYs, QFIs, all waving their hands around all over the place. And I sort of snuck past unnoticed, and I went up to the coffee bar because there was an old mate of mine from Valley days there called Jerry Shipley. And Jerry said, have a cup of coffee, and I said, thanks very much. So I was minding my own business when there was a door beside the coffee bar that went into the hangar. And suddenly this opened up, in came the squadron warrant officer, red-faced. And he said to me, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm having a cup of coffee. And he said, can't you see who's sitting over there? And I said, yeah, of course I can. And he really was almost apoplectic with rage. And by now, his voice went up one. This attracted the attention of the group sitting all around the table. And the station commander turned around, very rude, he said, who the hell are you? And I said, oh, sir, I'm Simford, I'm Squadron Leader Johns, and I've just flown in with the Prince of Wales. And up piped Prince Charles. And he said, oh, no, he didn't. I've never seen him before in my life. An absolute pandemonium. Yeah.
A great story. I love it. We're going to leap forward a little bit. Now, you got a lot of time on the Harrier in your time in the service. One thing that surprised me when you mentioned it in the book was that the Harrier was brought into service without a radio altimeter.
Yeah.
Now, what on earth was the rationale behind that?
Haven't got a clue. I don't know at all. I flew the GR1, was a very, very basic Harrier. The GR3, obviously, we're now sort of getting more like it, and various bits were added onto the GR3, like a RWR, radar warning receiver and so on, during my time on the GR3. But certainly in the early GR3s, we didn't have a rad out. And I can't remember whether one was fitted later on. I mean, when I went back to the Harrier Force as Force Commander, I can't remember, to be honest, if we had a rad out in the aeroplane then.
Perhaps we could explain to the listeners the importance of the radio altimeter in low flying.
Yeah, I mean, nearly all our flying in the Harrier was at low level, specifically out in Germany. And the rad out obviously gives you a very accurate, very precise readout of your height above the ground. And of course, it's not pressure dependent, and so on. So it was very important. It was particularly important, of course, when you were night flying and so on. We didn't have a rad out. And also a rad out, I mean, some of the weapons deliveries that we did, for example, lay down bombing, it was your height over the target. Had to be at a precise height. It was calculated. The bomb release technology was actually arranged. As you can tell, I wasn't a QI. Qualified weapons.
That's right, sir. I was.
Was arranged at your pass distance over the height, over the thing. This is pre-Falklands. It changed after that. Was a certain height. And of course, a rad out would have been very useful in judging that height, whereas basically you had to use a seaman's eye. Or if you had a very accurate pressure readout, well, perhaps you could read the altimeter then. But of course, you then had to allow, of course, for the height of the ground above sea level, etc., etc. So it was very much seaman's eye, unless you had an accurate readout from an altimeter. But why they didn't put one in the first place, I don't know. But there were.
No, it always confused me. I remember that appalling accident of a Harrier pilot over Norway, deceived by his actual height when he flew over a plantation of tiny fir trees in the snow.
Yes.
And he had believed them, of course, to be big fir trees, normal-sized fir trees, and got himself so close to the ground when he banked the aircraft, he hit the deck. So very sad.
Yes, I didn't know about that. That would have been a one squadron aeroplane, probably.
Moving on to the Falklands War a little bit, and perhaps our opinion of the Harrier. You became the Harrier Force Commander, so you knew a great deal about the aircraft. The Falklands War may have coloured our opinion of the Harrier a little bit, but looking back on it as an aircraft that has now completed its service, did it live up to its potential in actual operations? And in particular, I noted that in America, the Congress have been quite scathing about the United States Harriers, the AV-8B, particularly its loss rates when compared with the F-18, which was also carrier-borne, and the F-16, which was another single-engine aircraft. The loss rates in actual combat, as far as the Americans were concerned, were unacceptably high. And in the RAF, they were even worse. So, is there a defence for that?
Well, I mean, I think you have to draw a very clear line between the early days on the Harrier and its operational application in the Falklands War. When I went to the OCU at Wittering, I always remember that the chap in charge of B Squadron, when he gave us his welcome talk before we started doing all the ground school and so on and so forth, he said, right, the Harrier, easy to fly, easy to crash. And those were his opening words. And what he meant was absolutely true. If you stayed within, and we're talking purely about VSTOL here. I mean, once you were outside 100 knots, it was like any other, it was like flying a Hunter. It wasn't nearly as good as a Hunter to fly, but it just flew conventionally. But you had this speed band between 100 knots go down to about 30 knots, where if the aeroplane were pointed out of the relative airflow, and you induce yaw, you had to make sure that you corrected that very, very quickly, because if the yawing moment came strong, what's the secondary effect of yaw? It's roll. Now, the aeroplane started rolling. You then suddenly ended up in a situation where the puffer ducts and your aileron control was insufficient, and so the aeroplane kept rolling, down it went, crash, bang. Wow. So if you stayed within the limits, you were fine. The trouble was, the challenge was that the limits were pretty narrow. And of course, when you were coming down, or when you were in this transitional stage of flight, you weren't only keeping the aeroplane obviously into the relative airflow, and of course you had this lovely little vane on the nose, apart from the head-up display, to help you, and rudder shakers as well. Although, if I remember, they didn't work them at the OCU for whatever, I think for good reason. Anyway, by the way, you were also monitoring angle of attack. You were monitoring engine temperature, and so on. And of course, then, particularly when you're coming into land, you're also doing your vital actions. So there was a lot in the early days when you were converting on the aeroplane to think about. I mean, let alone eventually sort of landing on a bit of metal 70 foot by 70 foot. Let alone trying to find it when you're out on field operations, when you've done everything in your powers to make it very difficult to find, and so on. So in the early days, the accident rate in the Harrier, accident rate through mishandling of the aeroplane, and indeed through poor instrumentation in the aeroplane was high. And there's no getting away from that. I think, I can't remember the exact, I think it was 19 Harriers were lost between about 69 and 74, most of which were due to handling errors of one sort or the other. The US Marine Corps, who of course started converting, US Marine Corps, not Navy, remember that this is Marine Corps, they started converting onto the Harrier about almost the same time as we did, because they were very keen on getting the aeroplane. But they were sending people across to fly the Harrier who were ex-chopper pilots. And so not surprisingly, their accident rate, I don't know what it was, I can't quote you figures, probably it was equally as high as ours, if not probably higher, before they actually started to get the message that you had to have some pretty basic handling skills to cope with this very powerful aeroplane. People forget quite how powerful it was in terms of engine power. So eventually, it settled down. I mean, people didn't, the hierarchy in the Air Force didn't really understand the Harrier at the time. And the man who, in my view, had the greatest credit, or deserves the greatest credit for really sort of getting the Harrier Force, particularly in Germany, properly sorted out, not just in terms of what they were doing and the development of the field concept of operations, but in terms of logistics, support and so on, was one Group Captain George Black. And it was George Black who took a very serious grip on the Harrier Force just before I arrived, and then followed up by Paddy Hine, who was the boss when I took over 3 Squadron. And then the accident rate did that. It went way down. I mean, as I say, on my own tour on 3 Squadron, nearly 3 years, we only lost one aeroplane, and that was a straightforward engine malfunction. So things got remarkably better. If you then sort of fast forward to the Falklands War, of course, one squadron was sent south under my great old friend, sadly now dead, Peter Squire, who had been one of my flight commanders, on 3. And I think what we were always, we just wondered, not so much the survivability, how much damage the aeroplane could take in a real shooting war. Well, down in the Falklands, we lost, I think, 4 of the original 6 aeroplanes, but other airplanes were coming back, with a lot of holes in them. And the engineers were patching these up like, as quick as anything, and they were keeping the airplanes flying. And so we discovered in the Falklands War that the airplane could fight a real, tough war and survive. And the 4 we lost, 2 of them I can remember were certainly reattacks. And you talked to Bob Iverson about it.
Yeah.
Old chum.
You never reattack.
Well, Bob did, and I think Jerry Pook did as well. But I'm sorry, Jerry, if I've got that wrong. Might have been someone else, but I think 2 were lost through reattacks. And Bob Iverson, who was on 3 with me, and being a pupil or a student at Valley when I was instructing there, remains as a very good friend. He makes no bones about it. On the other hand, what he did at Goose Green might well have won the battle for the Paris. Who knows about that. So we got a great deal more confidence in the survivability of the aeroplane in a real shooting war.